Hey everyone, so have you ever thought about how the law proves that one thing actually caused another? You might think it's straightforward, but nope, it's not always that simple. Today, we're going to dive into this really cool legal idea called causation, basically, the chain that connects an action to what happens next.
Okay, so picture this. There's a fish farm, right? And it's downstream from a big factory. Then one day, bam, all the fish are dead. The farm owner points the finger straight at the factory's discharge pipe. Seems obvious, doesn't it? But here's the thing. In a courtroom, obvious doesn't cut it. You have to prove it. So how does the legal system actually build that bridge? How do they connect the dots and say, yep, this action led to that outcome?
Yeah, so in the legal world, you can't just walk in and say, come on, it's obvious. You have to actually establish what's called a causal link between the wrongful act and the damage that happened. And to do that, the courts have some very specific tools they use. Let's start with the classic one, the OG method. All right, so the main tool, the one that's been the go-to in common law for, like, ages, is something called the but-for test. Think of it as the traditional first line of attack for figuring out if one thing really caused another in a way the law cares about. So what exactly is this test? Well, at its heart, the but-for test is a pretty simple rule. Its whole job is to zero in on one specific action and figure out if that was the real reason someone suffered a loss or an injury. And it all comes down to asking one really powerful hypothetical question. Okay, so here's how it works. First, you ask that key question. Going back to our example. But for the factory pumping out that discharge, would the fish have died? Then, step 2, you look at the answer. If the answer is a hard no, like those fish would have been perfectly fine otherwise, then boom, the causal link is usually established. Seems pretty cut and dry, right? Well, what happens when the real world gets messy? Yeah, as you've probably guessed, the real world is almost never that simple. The but-for test, as neat as it sounds, has a pretty big weakness. It really starts to fall apart when things get, well, complicated. And here's where the problem really pops up. The test gets into trouble when the defendant's action is only part of the story. What if it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle? That simple but-for question suddenly gets a whole lot harder to answer with a clean yes or no. Let's just look at this visually. On one side, you've got a simple case. One cause leads to one effect. Just our one factory polluting the river. Here, the but-for test works like a charm. But now, look at the other side, the complex case. Imagine a second factory also starts dumping stuff into the same river. Now, if you ask, but for the first factory's actions, would the fish have died? Well, the answer might be, yeah, they still would have because of that other factory. And just like that, the test completely breaks down. So, because of this exact problem, the law had to adapt. It couldn't just stick with a test that failed in so many real-world situations. It needed a more flexible way to deal with these messy cases. And this led to a new, modern approach that's less about a rigid formula and more about, well, good old common sense. And this really was a huge shift in how the law thought about these things. It was a move away from trying to jam every single situation through the narrow little keyhole of the but-for test. Instead, the courts started asking a much broader, more practical question. And here it is, the new question. On the balance of probabilities, did the defendant's act cause, or, and this is the key phrase, materially contribute to the loss? Materially contributed. That is a total game changer. The law isn't asking if the factory was the only cause anymore. It's asking, was it a significant cause? Did it play a real, meaningful part in the fish dying, even if other things were going on too? This blows the door wide open for finding who's responsible. And when you boil it all down, this is what we're left with today. This quote really hits the nail on the head when it comes to the modern view. Quote, "The question of causation is considered to be a question of fact, which needs to be answered by applying a common sense approach." So it's not about some abstract logical puzzle anymore. It's a question of fact decided by common sense. Okay, so let's wrap this up with the key takeaways. First, and most importantly, proving that causal link is absolutely essential in the law. For a long time, the classic tool was the but-for test, which asked that simple hypothetical question. But as we saw, its big limitation is that it fails when you have complex cases with lots of different causes. And that brings us to the modern view, where courts now use a common sense approach that focuses on whether an action materially contributed to the final outcome. So this brings us to one last really interesting thought. This whole shift to a common sense approach seems more fair, right? More practical. But it does leave us with a fascinating question to chew on. The law now relies on common sense. But in a world where everyone's common sense can be different, whose version of it actually gets to decide the case? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this one.